Shalom and welcome to this week's edition of Messiah in the Torah. Now we have come to the final two Torah portions in the book of Exodus. Because this is not a leap year, those two portions are read in the same week. And they are called in Hebrew Vayakhel and Pekudei. And that means he gathered, and then secondly, countings. These two Torah portions actually are only repetitions of things that have been mentioned already about the building of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. And one can wonder why the Torah takes up so much space to mention these things not only one time but even twice. It means that it is a very, very important subject to God, because the ultimate goal of our salvation is that we will be a habitation for God's presence, both individually and also corporately together as God's people, that we are being built into a house that He can dwell. I want us to go to Ephesians chapter 2 and read what Paul is writing about that. Ephesians, the second chapter, where it says from verse 19, "So then you are no longer strangers and aliens." Isn't that good that we're not outsiders? We have been brought into the very family of God. "But you are fellow citizens with the saints," with God's people, "and members of God's house, the household of God, or the family of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Messiah Yeshua himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit." So the book of Exodus ends with the building of the tabernacle and how the Spirit and presence of God came down and filled the tabernacle. The Exodus was not complete until that moment, but once that they had been that God had come to dwell among them, they could then continue on the journey to the promised land. So this is a very, very important thing to God. He wants to dwell with His people. He wants to be with us with His presence. And so now, once again, then we read about how they are to build this dwelling place for God's presence. And it's very interesting now to note how it all begins. Let's go to chapter 35 in the book of Exodus and read from verse 1. "Moses assembled all the congregation of the people of Israel and said to them, 'These are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. 6 days work shall be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire in all your dwelling places on the Sabbath day.'" And then it comes in the next verse. Moses said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, "This is the thing that the Lord has commanded. Take from among you a contribution to the Lord." So you can start to build the tabernacle. But before they do that, God is emphasizing the importance of the Sabbath. And that is a spiritual principle that is very important in the Word of God, that everything begins with a position of rest before God. Let me just read a couple of verses from 1 John chapter 4 that deals with this thing. It says here in verse 10 and then also in verse 19, "In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins. And then in verse 19, we love because he first loved us. So our relationship to God is not built on our works. It is built on our acceptance first of his love towards us. It is worth to remember that the Sabbath day was the first day that Adam and Eve experienced. They had been created as the very final thing that God did on the eve of the Sabbath, at the end of the sixth day. That was the last thing that God did. So the first day that Adam and Eve experienced was the Sabbath. It started from a rest before God. And before we work for God, before we can do anything to build a holy habitation for his presence, which is the purpose of all our work for him, we have to first begin with resting in him. We have to acknowledge that he is the sovereign and that he is the author of everything. And we are only responding to what he first has shown towards us. We have nothing that he has not first given to us. We must come to that place of realization of his sovereignty and his work of provision for us before we do anything for him. Many of you, I'm sure, know about a very well-known Bible teacher in China many years ago. His name was Watchman. He wrote a classic about the Christian life called Sit, Walk, Stand. It was a commentary on the book of Ephesians, and he outlines the very foundation for our walk or our faith in God. So let's look at that. I want us to see that how he emphasizes that it all begins with rest. Let's go to Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, and read from verse 6. We can read verse 5 also here, actually. Even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Messiah. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Messiah Yeshua. So Watchman, he emphasizes that our walk with God, our relationship to God, it all begins with accepting what he has already done for us and how we are sitting with him in heavenly places. That is a position we never could work ourselves into. It is something that he has done. He has raised us up with Messiah and seated us with him in heavenly places, far above all principalities and powers. That's our position in him, and it is God's work. That is really the main message of the Sabbath, that it all begins with resting in God. After we have entered into that rest comes the second phase. We read in the first verse in chapter 4, it says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling, or you can say of the position that you now have as seated with Messiah in heavenly places. Now you have become holy. Now you need to begin to walk in holiness, walk a holy life. It says, walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. So that's the second step. After we have entered into a position of rest, after the Sabbath comes the first day of the week. It's the resurrection day. It is talking about power and strength to walk with God, to work for him, and to do the things that he has called us to do, and to live a holy life because we have been made holy. The Jewish people, they have a prayer of blessing that they always recite before they are ready to obey a commandment in the Torah. I'm sure many of you have heard it. Every such work of obedience or act of obedience in response to a command in the Torah it begins by saying this blessing: "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandment and has commanded us to." And then it follows whatever the command is. So Christians sometimes, they look down upon this and they say, well, we're not made holy because of what we do. We're made holy because the blood of Messiah that has been shed for us and made us holy. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. Yeshua, he prayed in John 17 and verse 17, "Sanctify them in truth. Your word is truth." It is through our obedience to God that we are able to live a holy life, because we have already become holy because of his blood. We have to walk out that sanctification in acts of obedience. This is so important. So let's go to 1 Peter chapter 1 and also read what Peter is saying about this. I want us to begin in verse 14. "As obedient children," that's what we're called to be. "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. But as he who has called you is holy, so you also be holy in all your conduct. Since it is written, 'You shall be holy, for I am holy.'" That means that we are holy not just as a position because we have been saved by grace and become set apart for God. The next step is to begin to walk in that holiness through obedience. So let's read on here. "And if you call on him as Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile." So we are to fear God. And how do we fear God? By obeying what he says. That's always the response, the outcome of fear of God. It doesn't mean that we're terrified in the wrong sense before him, but because we love him, we fear him. And in the sense we don't want to disobey him. And if we don't care, it means we don't love him. That's the fact. Fearing God is an expression of our love for God. Just like somebody asked me one time, "I cannot believe in a God that you have to fear." Well, I said, listen, I love my wife. I love her tremendously. And because I love her, I don't want to do things that hurt her. I am careful when I'm doing things that I don't do what I know will hurt her. It's the same with God. Just like I'm afraid in the sense to do things that are hurtful to the one I love. The same in our relationship with God. So let's read on here. "Knowing," verse 18 now, "knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers," that is a life of disobedience. "You were ransomed not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Messiah, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot." So here you see we have been bought with a price. We belong to God. Now we are to live in obedience to him. Verse 22, "Having purified your souls," how? "By your obedience to the truth, for a sincere brotherly love. Love one another earnestly from a pure heart." So the goal is love for all our fellow man, to love God first and then to love our fellow man. And that's the goal of the Torah. It's all summed up in those two love commandments. It shows us what God has told us to do in order to love our neighbor. So that is the second thing then in our relationship to God, that is that we are to walk in holiness, worthy the calling that we have received. And then we come into the third phase in chapter 6 in Ephesians, and that is when we are able to overcome the enemy in the battle we have with Satan. So it says in verse 10, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. So this is the third step, standing. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers, over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. So standing against the enemy, overcoming him, is a result first of entering into a rest before God, accepting his love, his forgiveness, a position of being seated with Messiah in heavenly places. The second thing is to begin to walk in a way worthy of that calling, because we are a holy people. We are supposed to walk in holiness. And if we do that, then we can overcome the enemy. So it all begins with the Sabbath, and that's the lesson we learn here from the Torah in this week's Torah portion. Before they are ready now to build the tabernacle, they are first reminded of the importance of the Sabbath. Resting, the Sabbath is more important than what we do for God. Now, it says that they are to take up the offering now again from verse 4. Moses said, this is Exodus 35, Moses said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, this is the thing that the Lord has commanded. Take from among you a contribution to the Lord. Whoever is of a generous heart, let him bring the Lord's contribution. And then it lists all the things needed for the tabernacle in order to build a habitation for God, a dwelling place for God. They had to take up an offering, give a contribution. And this, we know, was done in such a way that they gave even more than was what was needed. God motivated them because they had such a willingness to give. And this has always been a result when we love God. When in every revival there is always a generous outflow of giving towards God, because that's our response to his love toward us. And let's read on what happened here in the wilderness from verse 20. It says, then all the congregation of the people of Israel departed from the presence of Moses, and they came, everyone whose heart stirred him, and everyone whose spirit moved him, and brought the Lord's contribution to be used for the tent of meeting, and for all its service, and for the holy garments. Two things are mentioned here. It says, everyone whose heart stirred him. That's number one. And then everyone whose spirit moved him. And I'm going to comment on that in a moment, but let's go to the book of 2 Corinthians and read what Paul says happened in the congregations in Macedonia. It says from verse 1, 2 Corinthians 8, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So just like happened to the children of Israel in the desert in their first love, we mentioned that in the earlier Torah portion, that in the book of Jeremiah, it says how God remembered their bridal love in the youth, in the wilderness, how they loved God, the children of Israel. And the love for God is expressed in our willingness to give to Him. And it says here in verse 3, for they gave according to their means, as I can testify. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us. Let's comment a little bit on this. It says here two things. They gave according to their means, but secondly, they even gave beyond the means. And that's exactly how the rabbis interpret what happened here in Exodus 35 when the contribution was given by the people of Israel. Because in the Hebrew language, I want to read what it literally says there in verse 21 of Exodus 35 in the Hebrew. It says, "And they came, every man whose heart uplifted him." That was the first thing. And then secondly, everyone whose spirit moved him. So here we also have these two categories. And the rabbis, they said that everyone whose spirit moved him, the second thing here, it means that they were motivated, they gave as they were motivated in their hearts to give what they could. So they gave motivated by in their hearts by what they were able to give. So that was the first thing. But secondly, it says also whose heart uplifted them. The rabbis, they interpret this to mean that the people gave even more than they could afford, because their desire to give to the tabernacle was so great. So we see here that it happened exactly the same thing as what Paul describes about the churches in Macedonia, how they gave even beyond their means. And that is not strange, I'm sure, because Paul, he was a rabbi who had been educated by the most learned rabbi in those days, Gamliel, and he, I'm sure, knew about this meaning of what it says here in the book of Exodus, how they gave to the building of the tabernacle. And he saw a parallel to what happened in Macedonia when they gave even more than they could. Their hearts uplifted them, inspired them to go even beyond their means. Now, let's read on here. This is something interesting in verse 22. It says, "So they came, both men and women. All who were of a willing heart brought brooches and earrings and signet rings and armlets, all sorts of gold objects, every man dedicating an offering to the gold to the Lord." Once again, here in the Hebrew, it literally says, instead of "so they came both men and women," it says that the men came with the women. And it is understood that it was actually the women who had the greatest eagerness to give. And so the men just followed the lead of the women. And we see the things that are mentioned first here are the things typical that women own, brooches, earrings, signet rings, armlets, and so forth. So the women had the greatest eagerness to give. And that's many times the way it is even today. That women they have a tenderness towards God, an openness towards God to respond to needs and to take initiative when it comes to giving. In fact, the ones who are mentioned last are the leaders, the princes. Let's see here what it says in verse 27. "And the leaders brought onyx stones and stones to be set for the ephod and for the breastpiece." Here's something very interesting, because the word in Hebrew here for leaders is nisiim. And that Hebrew word contains two yod, the letter yod, which is the smallest letter in the alphabet, corresponding to our letter I. And it is one of the letters in the holy name of God, Yod, He, Vav, God. But here in the text, the letter Yod is removed from the word Nisiim. So, in other words, one of the letters from the holy name of God is not there. And it is clear to the sages, the Torah teachers, that this is an indication of a lack of godliness on their part, in that they were the last ones to come forward to give, even though they were leaders. They were more calculating. They gave the most expensive stuff. It says here, onyx stones and stones set for the ephod. Those are very expensive things. But they waited until last to give. And so when the Torah was written, by the inspiration of God, they removed the letter Yod from the word for the leaders. An indication that they were not honored in their giving in the same way as those who gave even with such inspiration that they gave beyond their means. So once again, we only have time to touch on very few things here in these Torah portions for this week. I wished I would have time to talk about the menorah. It's so inspiring. You can go to our website, thewatchman.org, and subscribe to Weekly Torah if you want to have more of the fuller commentaries on these Torah portions. But it is so inspiring to see how the same thing that happened when they built the tabernacle in the wilderness for a presence of God, that has always characterized every revival, every move of God, when the Spirit of God has inspired people to give to God's work. And may God bless you, and shalom from Jerusalem.